it's not enough to say I'm not racist and I don't, I'm happy for people of any color or background to have opportunity. You have to actively promote it. And I think the active promotion is so important. And I know that's why John is so passionate about it. It's not enough for us to sit on our hands and say, well, I'm not racist, so therefore there's no problem. Actually, you've got to be much more coherent in terms of promoting it. And I think some teams have done very well. I think Formula One has had some really good initiatives, but the proof of the pudding is whether when you have that team photograph taken at the end of each year, what's the makeup of the team? Who are the people you're employing at the factory? Who are the schools and universities that you're working with? Who are the people that you are reaching out to and communicating with? And this is, I think, again, why the Hamilton Commission was such a very practical step for Lewis to have taken.
You're listening to the Mission Makers Show, a podcast that inspires humans to get into the mindset of success. My name's Farah Nanji, and I'm the founder of a business in the motorsports industry that explores leadership lessons from things like Formula One. I'm also a DJ and music producer in the underground electronic scene, and a public speaker on key topics like resilience, building high-performance teams, overcoming learning difficulties, and stimulating creativity. And to tie it all together, I love writing thought-provoking content as a journalist for these industries which are so unique in themselves. On this show, I'm sitting down with some of the most inspiring and driven people I've met around the world to talk about their processes, their failures, the lessons they've learned, and how they are truly making an impact for this world. It's the penultimate episode of Season 3, and I'm super excited to be joined today by my colleague, Mark Gallagher. Mark is a renowned figure in Formula One, with over 30 years dedicated to the sport. He has held C-suite positions with leading brands such as Red Bull Racing, where he's helped establish their commercial arms, as well as a decade on the management board of the highly successful race-winning team Jordan Grand Prix with Eddie Jordan. He's worked closely with some of the most highly acclaimed drivers from Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard, and he's also a fantastic motivational speaker, speaking regularly for companies around the world about how they can benefit from the leadership lessons learned in Formula One, such as teamwork, managing risk, technology and more. It's safe to say we've got a mammoth episode today, touching upon all of the above, plus his thoughts on the upcoming Formula One season, with a lot of incredibly behind-the-scenes insight, and I'm super, super excited to dive in. But just before we begin, if you're interested in some really cool rewards like virtual DJ lessons, the chance to ask our guests questions and exclusive merchandise, head over to www.patreon.com/missionmakers to check out how you can access these exclusive rewards. And thank you to all of you who've been writing into us and subscribing to the show. It really makes a difference. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you love the content we're making here at Mission Makers and help us take this show to the next level. Mark, welcome to Mission Makers. How are you doing today?
I'm really good. Great to talk to you, Farah. And it's been a long time.
It has indeed. Pre-COVID, I think was the last time we actually caught up properly. So it's great to have an excuse to catch up today. But no, you're an amazing human. What you've achieved in motorsport is absolutely remarkable, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity to invite you to Mission Makers today and pick your brains on all things motorsport. So one of the first questions.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you already. Yeah, very happy to join you, and honestly, it's very kind of you to introduce me in that way. I don't feel I've achieved anything that a lot of people haven't achieved who have gone on to pursue a career in this wonderful sport of ours, but it's certainly a great opportunity on Mission Makers to share my thoughts and insights on whatever it is you want to talk to me about, and I'm looking forward to it. Really can't wait.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's a talented bunch in Formula One, so I hear you on that. So one of the first questions that we actually like to ask our guests is really going a bit deeper into the meaning of their name. And interestingly, we asked a Formula One driver this question on Mission Makers, as he shares the same first name as you. So I'm very interested to hear your response. And I wonder if you can guess which driver it was as well. But the meaning of your name, Mark, is, from what we researched, found it means warlike or warrior. So do you think that this might subconsciously feed into your incredibly strong and driven character?
Wow. Can I guess that the driver was Mark Webber?
You're wrong, but very
Oh,
close.
okay. I'll have to think about that further. Um, Gosh, warlike. I think one of the things which is definitely a feature of me, and I suppose my career that I've had has been quite a strong resilience, and I probably do battle through changes whenever they come up. I've had to kind of reinvent myself a couple of times, which I think is quite normal for any career. You know, I went from journalist into PR, from PR into sponsorship, from sponsorship into senior management roles. So I've always kind of had to battle through a degree of reinvention, but I think that's the nature of the world we live in. You know, nothing stays the same for very long. So yeah, maybe there's something in that, but really interesting to think about
Yeah, definitely. Warrior mindset for sure. And the driver was Mark Blundell.
it. Super.
So
Great guy. I mean, and there's a great guy. He has got. I mean, I'm sure you had a wonderful time talking to him because he is kind of a contemporary of mine. When I would have been in my early 20s, Mark was arriving in motorsport, and he was a superb driver. And in fact, I got to know his father quite well. His father was a hell of a personality, and to then see what Mark went on to achieve. And as you well know, Mark was part of they called themselves the Rat Pack. There was Damon Hill, there was Mark Blundell, there was Martin Donnelly, there was Perry McCarthy, Johnny Herbert, a little group of kind of 1980s British racing drivers, and they all went on to achieve extraordinary things in motorsport. So I've been privileged to get to know them over the years. So nice to know that you had Mark on, and he certainly fits the bill of a warrior and a fighter.
absolutely. And we'll definitely talk about that. As you alluded to, you have worn quite a few hats in your motorsport career. And so let's just go straight to the beginning. You know, what first led you down that rabbit hole of motorsport?
It is interesting to reflect on what it is that triggers your interest in the sport. I was telling you before we pressed the record button on the podcast that I moved house just before Christmas last year, and in doing so, I had to go through lots of archive and things that I've gathered over the years. And I came across the very first book on motor racing that was bought for me by my father in 1973. And I remember he was on a business trip to England. Obviously, I'm from Ireland, and when he came home, he had bought this book. And it was all about Formula One and racing. And when I saw the book, I vividly remember him handing that to me, and it coincides with the first year that I remember watching Formula One races on television. So I was 11 years old, and I remember watching Jackie Stewart winning a Grand Prix and winning the championship that year. So 1973 seems to have been a year when I really got to know the sport and had a couple of memorable things happen. But I know that I used to watch racing before that. You know, when I was 8, 9 years of age, we'd watch it on television. So I think somewhere in all of that, my father probably played a key role. And it was actually only many, many years later, unfortunately, around the time that he passed away in 2002, that I came to realize that he used to go to see major sports car races in the 1950s. And in Northern Ireland at the time, we had an event called the Tourist Trophy, which was held in Dundrod, and it had all of the greats: Juan Manuel Fangio, Sterling Moss, Mike Hawthorne, all of the top drivers at the time came to that. And apparently, my dad used to go and watch those events and get terribly excited about them. So he must have passed some of that passion on, and certainly I like to think that maybe that's part of my DNA is the passion that my dad had for racing.
Very, very interesting. And so, did you kind of know from the beginning that it was journalism and broadcasting that you wanted to get into, and what were your sort of experiences in that role?
So this is again a very topical point because when I moved house again, I came across my scrapbooks, and when I was a kid at school, I had started making these scrapbooks about racing and rallying, and I don't know what the contemporary equivalent would be. There's probably a digital version, but I would literally cut things out of magazines, and I would write stories about races and rallies, and I got to know a few drivers myself because of friends of my families who were involved in rallying and involved in racing. And so I think at really quite an early age, I had an interest in observing the sport and recording it and reporting on it and writing about it. So that was clearly quite a formative experience. But then definitely in my teenage years, I started to think about how could I work in motorsport. And like I think probably like everyone, you go through a phase of thinking I'd love to drive, and I used to think about that, but I quickly banished that because my family were a you know comfortably well off family, but they weren't a super rich family, and I wasn't going to be sponsored by my father to become a Formula Ford driver or something. So I kind of parked that quite early on. And while I was at university studying economics and business management, I suppose my passion for the sport began to evolve into I just loved the complexity of it. I loved the fact that to get a car on the track or to get a car on the rally circuit, you've got to design and manufacture it. You've got to get it sponsored. You've got to find the money somewhere. There's a whole bunch of things have to happen. It's such an interesting cocktail behind the world of motorsports. So that really began to interest me. And then when I graduated and was fortunate enough to apply for and land a job at Autosport magazine, that really enabled me to come into the industry, because Autosport back in those days was we're talking pre-internet, so it was the go-to publication. Everyone in the UK, everyone in UK motorsport bought Autosport every week, and if you read Autosport cover to cover, you quickly got to know the industry. So that became my kind of segue into the professional side of racing. I worked in the advertising department of Autosport to begin with, and then quickly began to pester the editor to let me write for them. And within a few years, within actually a very few years, I was working and writing full time for Autosport, Motoring News, and other publications, and really enjoyed that early opportunity working in the media. It's a fantastic way to get to know everyone in the industry.
Mm. What's your view of the current state of media in Formula One at the moment?
Oh, that's a lovely question, Farah, because I think my own personal view is that the sport has never been healthier from so many perspectives, because we have an embarrassment of riches. Again, it's difficult for me to talk about this without sounding like a really old person, but I have to recognize I've now been in this industry for, almost 4 decades, and we have gone from a world in which it was really difficult to follow motorsport, follow Formula One. It was difficult you couldn't see practice sessions, you couldn't see qualifying sessions. Quite often you couldn't see an entire race. And certainly there was no internet, so there was no rolling news coverage. It was a race, a magazine that came out 4 days later. I mean, it was, if you were hungry for the sport, that hunger was seldom satisfied. And now you can eat, live, and breathe motor racing 7 days a week if you choose to. So I think, so much better today. And I love what Sky Sports F1 do. I love what Channel 4 in the UK have done. And I work with Jacques Villeneuve, who works for Canal Plus in France, and I know the work that he does there. Mika Hakkinen, who I work with, is about to start working with broadcaster in the Nordic region in this year's World Championship. And so I work with a lot of these people and see the degree to which they are being able to communicate their insight in the sport. So I think the sport's very healthy in so many ways, and I think the media generally are incredibly good at serving the fan base. There are individual journalists who are absolutely outstanding. You know, I wouldn't normally name names, but I will say that, you know, I read Andrew Benson on the BBC. I read Mark Hughes because he gives tremendous insight in Motorsport magazine. Of course, I've got my colleagues who I work with at Grand Prix Racing magazine and Motorsport Network, Stuart Codling and Ben Anderson, Chris Medland. You know, lots of really good, influential journalists who know the sport inside out. And then, of course, you have the social media observers, and some of them are excellent. I mean, really, I get a good laugh and a good enjoyment from following some of these professional and semi-professional social media journalists who cover the sport, because again, you get all of this diversity of input and feedback, so you get a very broad range of opinions about the subject. So I think that's all really great. And if I'm going to add a but to this answer, there is no doubt that the but to the media in F1 and motorsport these days is the dreadful toxicity that you come across on social media. And I'm very careful about what I post on social media, and that's probably a pity, because I do really have to think about expressing opinions, because you will automatically get a backlash if it's perceived in someone else's worldview that you've said the wrong thing. And I've only, I think, twice had a really, you know, have been trolled. I've been really have faced a backlash. Once was after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix and the infamous last lap between Max and Lewis, and I totally not just understand, I totally buy into the total and utter frustration of Mercedes and Lewis fans as to what happened in Saudi Arabia last year. Mm. But I think it is a real shame that a proportion of those fans then take their anger out on anyone who is going to comment on what happened in any way other than a narrative which they agree with. And I happen to be one of those people who don't agree that what happened was a racist assault on Lewis to prevent him winning an eighth championship. I think it was a mistake. I think it was a mistake with quite a profound impact on the sport's reputation. But I don't agree with a lot of the narrative that then was built around that, because I'm a great believer that most people go to work to do a good job, and I include Michael Massey in that, and he's a professional, and you know what happened on that day happened. But the social media backlash that can sometimes now emerge if there's anything of a controversial nature, I think is a shame. And it's certainly in recent months led me to question the way in which the sport has embraced social media, to the extent that I think some of the narrative around the sport is now so damaging.
I mean, online toxicity is such a big and important topic, and the platforms absolutely need to do so much more to prevent and educate people from this sort of mindset of, just as you say, just going out after anyone who has a different opinion to the driver that they love. I mean, what are your thoughts on the Netflix Drive to Survive Bandcamp? Like, are you a fan of how it's been portrayed? Obviously seeing so many sides of the motorsport coin yourself.
I love it. I think that I get the fact that some people say, well, it's attracted a certain type of fan who has bought into a kind of soap opera version of Formula One. That's fine. You know, it's attracted a much bigger fan base. In my day job, I speak to corporate clients all over the world, and the drivers that I work with do the same. And I can promise you that during the middle of a global pandemic, we have seen business increase significantly because people are binge watching Drive to Survive and enjoying finding out about Formula One. And I think there's a really important point here, which is that so much of the emphasis on the Netflix effect has been to discuss the influx of new fans into the sport. But there's, in my experience, because people tell me this, we have seen a lot of fans return to Formula One. So these are people who fell out of love with Formula One quite often during the Schumacher era, I've had more than one senior executive say to me, gosh, I got bored with Formula One when Schumacher was winning everything back in the 2000s. So I haven't watched it for 10 years, but now I've fallen in love with it again because, Netflix reminded me that there are more than two teams. There are eight other teams, and even a driver or a team at the back of the grid has got a great story to share. So I think what Formula One has done under Liberty in allowing the Netflix series to flourish, and then the way the teams and drivers have engaged with it is terrific. Obviously, there is a danger that over time, drivers' teams might start to use it in the wrong way to communicate things in perhaps a much less authentic way, a much more controlled kind of public relations way, which would be a shame because I think you need that fly on the wall element to bring it to life. But I love what Netflix have done, and I personally see no reason, if it's not handled correctly, why that could not be a permanent feature of the sport going forward.
Yeah, it's absolutely, incredible how many fans they've brought in this new blood, as you say, into the sport. So let's talk a little bit about your professional journey in motorsports, because I know that you were head of marketing with more than a decade of management on the board of Jordan Grand Prix. You then incredibly went on to set up the commercial arm of Red Bull Racing. So yeah, tell our audience a little bit more about sort of, about what that journey was like.
Yeah, it was well, great times is the answer. Many good experiences. The Jordan involvement again slightly came from my background because I'm Irish, and obviously Eddie Jordan being Irish, I met him in fact when I was 14 years of age. I asked him for his autograph. He was a very successful driver at the time, and then many years later, fast forward 10 years, I was working at Autosport and then got to kind of connect with him professionally. And very good friend of mine from Ireland, Martin Donnelly, had become a very capable Formula 3 driver and actually then drove for Eddie in Formula 3000 and was managed by Eddie into Formula 1 with Team Lotus. So I developed all of these connections and ended up working with Eddie at the foundation of Jordan Grand Prix, and through that first memorable season when the team finished fifth in the World Championship and of course gave Michael Schumacher his debut, and we had a remarkable year. So I then left Eddie for a while. I was working for him on a freelance basis that first season, and I went off and did other things for a couple of years, and then came back to Jordan in at the end of basically in 1995, and brought with me a sponsor, which was Hewlett Packard, and that helped to shift me into the commercial role that then became my job from then on. And they were great times, a lot of hard work. Eddie was a demanding boss, but he was inspiring to work with, and we had a lot of fun, and we achieved so many goals. The first victory in Belgium was in 1998, was a really memorable moment in my life and in the team's career. So the time at Jordan was a really memorable experience, and I'm thankful for the fact that I did take time to reflect during that period that we were probably going through something special. I think all too often you don't do that, but I have tended to be a person who's tried to, wake up and smell the coffee so every so often. So I did realize at times this was pretty special. So that was really great. And the nice thing about being part of Jordan was that you were given a lot of responsibility. I think the marketing department at Jordan, by the end, I think we had something like 30, I think I had 30 people working for me in the marketing at Jordan. So all the sponsorship and hospitality and public relations and merchandising, and it was pretty substantial. And we were, interestingly, Farah, we were running on a budget. At our peak, we were running on a budget which today is the cost cap. More than 20 years later.
Wow.
So we were doing something right as a small independent team. And then the Red Bull opportunity came as a result of, a call. Literally, when I'd left Jordan Grand Prix, I got a call and asked to come and help them. And I only worked with Red Bull. I mean, it was Jaguar Red Bull. It was that pivot point as Jaguar transformed into Red Bull Racing. I only worked with the team for about a year, but obviously met Christian. I was in the team before Christian was employed. Obviously, Adrian Newey hadn't joined the team, but I remember having a long conversation with David Coulthard about whether he should come and drive for the team, and of course he subsequently agreed to do that because he was he had exited McLaren the previous year. And I love the fact that I was in there at the beginning, met Dietrich Mateschitz, worked with him, and had the job of setting up that initial portfolio of sponsors that the team had. I have a slight regret that I didn't stay at Red Bull, but the decision was taken out of my hands because Red Bull wanted to run the commercial operations from Salzburg, and so I went off. But actually, they did me a favor because it was the money that Red Bull paid me off with that then helped me to set up my own racing team, and we did the A1GP Championship, and that became my next thing. And again, going back to your earlier on in the podcast, as I mentioned, my name kind of about being a warrior and fighting. When I left Red Bull, I decided to do something difficult, which was to set up a team, and was very fortunate to meet an Irish businessman called Mark Kershaw, and basically he provided the funding and I provided the, if you like, the expertise to set the team up, and we had just an amazing and fun time together, he and I particularly, with that whole program. So really one opportunity leads to another, and my Jordan and Red Bull experiences were extremely important to me because it showed me the basics of what's needed to be successful in Formula One. And I don't think that the formula for success has actually changed that much, even if the technology and the complexity of the sport has evolved. I don't think the fundamental requirements to be a competitive team have ever really changed.
What is that formula of success in your opinion?
Very clear leadership. Working for Eddie, he used to say to me, my name is, his name, Jordan, is over the door of the factory. He's the buck stops with him. So you have very clear leadership. He was very focused on getting deals done. He was very deal focused. People, I found it interesting. People used to criticize Eddie for being money oriented. Well, if you're not money oriented as a business person, you won't have much of a business. And Frank Williams and Ron Dennis and all of the greats have been money focused because you need money to feed the beast that is a Formula One team. So Eddie provided very clear commercial leadership, and he also then employed the right people in key roles. And whether it was asking Gary Anderson to design the first cars, or bringing in notable people like Sam Michael and Dino Tozo as race engineers, who themselves went on to become very senior people in Formula One. Of course, Sam is technical director of Williams, and you look at Andy Green, today still in the senior technical role at Aston Martin F1. 30 years after he was one of the three designers of the first Jordan F1 car. So Eddie provided good, strong leadership, invested in the right people, give people the opportunity to be the best of themselves, create a framework within which you all were pulling in the same direction. I think those things stand the test of time. And when I look at what Toto Wolff has achieved at Mercedes-Benz, you only have to speak to Toto for a short amount of time about the success of Mercedes, and he again will talk to you about having very clear goals and ambitions, having a team of people who are empowered to deliver to these ambitious goals, to have the right kind of transparency. And Farah, as Mercedes have a fantastic communications team, and one of the things they do is they do the post-race debrief, which they provide to the general public and to the media, and that actually tells you a lot about Mercedes. They have this passion to share. How can we improve week to week to week? How can we get better next weekend, next month, next year? They're never satisfied. They have this constant curiosity to perform better, and that comes from the strength of the leadership and the fact that Toto realizes that he can't design the car, he can't build the engine, but what he can do is he can create an environment within which the best people are attracted to come and work for the team and to deliver great success for them. So again, for a sport that spends so much of its time talking about technology and complexity and rules and regulations and money, actually the thing which defines the successful teams are people, and it's the human qualities. It's the way those people interact and work together. That's the magic formula. It comes down to how people work together. And the flip side of that is that when you look at an unsuccessful team in Formula One, you don't have to look too far to find quite negative behaviors. And earlier this year, I did an interview with Jos Capito for Grand Prix Racing magazine. And I found my chat with him absolutely fascinating, because in telling me what he did since he joined Williams, it kind of showed me what was wrong at Williams beforehand. And this was something I had kind of already gained an insight to because I supplied them with engines when I was at Cosworth. But, Jos talked about the fact that there were different factions within the team, that they weren't really all pulling in the same direction, that communications were not really that strong. There was kind of slightly vague leadership. And there was the blame culture. He talked about the fact that he does not now have a blame culture in the team. So that means by default that the team must have had a blame culture before. And of course, if you have people blaming each other every time something goes wrong, it just destroys team cohesion, and it's destructive. So I think this, as I've gotten older, this fascination I have with what makes a good team great and what makes a poor team bad is really interesting. It comes down usually to the people.
How do you think the leadership styles differ between Christian and Toto?
Very well. There's an interesting one. Very different personalities. Let's talk about what they have in common. What they have in common is an absolute passion to win. And it reached the surface. That passion came out during 2021. Whether it's Toto throwing his headphones across the garage and shouting at the camera, or whether it's Christian getting upset and giving interviews that he made it pretty clear what he thought about things that were going on. Here you have two guys who are wearing their heart on their sleeve because they eat, live and breathe Formula One. They want to win. They don't want to leave any stone unturned. Their styles of management are probably quite different. Oddly enough, I probably know more about Toto's style of management because I've done some work I've been fortunate enough through the work that I do to gain some insight to his style of leadership, and I follow what he has put on YouTube and put out there on social media, and I actually love watching videos of the corporate events at which he's spoken at. And I think Toto is an extraordinary leader who has, of course, a deep passion for the sport from a young age. He's had this hugely successful entrepreneurial phase of his life when he's made his money, and then come into Formula One, and of course is not an employee of Daimler-Benz, but he's a 1/3 shareholder. He owns the team. He's got skin in the game with that team. So there's a lot about Toto that is really very interesting, and I think he's an avid reader. He has a strong belief in that kind of entrepreneurial approach to leading a Formula One team by getting the best people to come and work for you, creating an atmosphere that people are infected with their enthusiasm to work harder and to achieve success. So I think I understand that a lot, probably better with Toto than I do with Christian. Yet I would have spent more time personally with Christian over the years, and I think Christian Horner has done a remarkable job over 17 years at Red Bull Racing, because he has been a steady hand on the tiller during some probably quite turbulent times, because I don't think that Red Bull ever accept anything other than winning. So I can't imagine Dietrich Mateschitz and Helmut Marko have given Christian an entirely easy time over the years. But somehow Christian has managed Red Bull's expectations, invested their money in the right way. He and Adrian have formed this extraordinary duet. I mean, it's the Christian Adrian partnership to me is no different from Ron Dennis and John Barnard in the 80s, or Patrick Head and Frank Williams, or Gary Anderson and Eddie Jordan. I think it's a beautiful kind of partnership where Christian's out there leading from the front, doing all the media stuff, dealing with the sponsors, Adrian handling all the technical side. So actually quite a traditional structure that they have at Red Bull. And Christian's clearly been doing something very, very right all these years, because they may not have won the World Championship between 2014 and 2020, but they were constantly knocking on the door and winning races. And it is quite extraordinary, whatever any listener thinks about what happened in Saudi Arabia that decided the 2021 World Championship. The very fact that the only team that took the fight to Red Bull to Mercedes as earnestly as they did was Red Bull Racing, that an energy drinks owned Formula One team has, you know, shown a clean pair of heels to Ferrari and fought tooth and nail against Mercedes. I think Christian clearly has done something absolutely right there. So different characters, different personalities, probably slightly different senses of humor. You know, they're different nationalities. You know, there's these are all different factors, but no question that what joins Christian and Toto at the hip is their deep, unbridled passion to succeed in this business, and that's why their teams are successful.
Hey you, we hope you're enjoying today's episode. We're on a serious mission here to create one of the world's best podcast series, and we'd be so grateful if you could support us in any way by becoming a patron of the show. There's a tier to suit every level, from early bird tiers where you get downloads to all my music with some super cool ninja stickers, to our VIP Mission Maker tiers where you get epic rewards like exclusive footage that never gets aired, the chance to submit questions to our guests with signed copies of books from them, DJ lessons, one-to-one coaching, and a whole load of super cool Ninja and Mission Maker merchandise. You can start supporting us for less than what it costs you to fill up your car for a month by simply heading over to www.patreon.com/Mission Makers. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. You mentioned turbulence there, so you've definitely seen many of the crises that Formula One has faced over the last few decades, you know, things like losing tobacco's sponsorship and so on and so forth. So, you know, and then obviously today we're still in that sort of COVID-19 crisis. So has that been one of the biggest that you've experienced? And what are your thoughts on how like the sport has handled this crisis?
What a terrific question. I think the answer I'll give you to that is what I tell my corporate clients, which is that if you look at Formula One over the last 20 years, it has actually faced a crisis of some kind every 4 years, pretty well.
Interesting.
You know, around about 2000, we lost a huge number of technology sponsors because there was a sort of technology boom and bust in North America. And I remember talking to my opposite number at Williams at the time, and us discussing the fact that the sponsorship was going through a rocky period. And then 4 years later, we lost tobacco sponsorship, which wasn't a small thing. And I think people forget just how big that was. I mean, it was enormous. It cut the feet from underneath the sport. And many of us at the coalface were wondering how the sport would survive this, because we were almost completely reliant on major tobacco sponsors to provide the primary source of funding. And it's interesting how the sport resisted that change. And for a number of years, teams were still looking for title sponsors with $70, $80, $90 million. it took a lot of people a long time to realize that those days had gone and they were never coming back. So the tobacco shift was dramatic, and then of course in 2008 we had the financial crisis, and teams like Williams were sponsored by Royal Bank of Scotland, and those big banking deals. ING sponsored Renault at the time. They all these major sponsors disappeared, and then of course you had the next kind of shift starting to occur. The arrival of environmental sustainability as a real issue for sponsors. They didn't want to be associated with gas guzzling, petrol head, fossil fueled sport, all that kind of stuff. So in many respects, I think Formula One has now got this inbuilt resilience, and it's developed that. And when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, and I'm pretty sure it was that the Friday of the Australian Grand Prix, when it was cancelled in 2020, I'm pretty sure that was the 13th of March. So I have to check that. But anyway, Friday the 13th was a bad day for F1. But it is amazing to think that the sport within 4 months had pivoted to being a predominantly European championship with some races in the Gulf, and that it successfully put on a 17 race calendar, and then in parallel to that also pivoted online with a greater involvement in esports, and pushing the esports as a kind of online version of Formula One, which more fans could engage with. And of course that met with great success. And then in 2021, with the pandemic in full force, to have a 22 race world championship, including somehow being able to go and race in some of the long haul destinations, it's been extraordinary. And then again, you mentioned the Netflix effect. In the middle of the global pandemic, not only has Formula One put on a 22 race world championship, it put on one of the most exciting world championships in recent years. And it also saw a growth in its audiences, and it saw an influx in sponsors thanks to some degree to the Netflix effect. And it really does beg the question, if this is what Formula One can do in the middle of a global pandemic, what can it achieve when things get back to normal? So I think the sport has coped with the pandemic in an extraordinary way. And, we haven't even talked about the fact that in the middle of the pandemic, we've also had the Black Lives Matter movement develop. We've had the We Races One campaign, the purpose-driven campaign, the push on increased diversity and inclusion, and all of these other topics which have really taken center stage over the last 2 years. So it felt like a really interesting and exciting time for the sport. It doesn't always get everything right. Obviously, mistakes get made, but I think the overall trajectory for Formula One has been terrific.
I couldn't agree more. We had Peter Windsor on the show last season, and we were discussing how we think governments could probably take a lot of lessons from the way that Formula One handled the COVID-19 crisis, because they definitely didn't handle it as well as I think Formula One has. As you say, remarkable achievements despite all of these things. You've touched upon diversity and stuff, so I do want to ask you, what your thoughts are on that. Do you believe that the sport is doing enough to level out the playing field, both in terms of gender and race?
I don't think it can ever say it's doing enough until the teams reflect the society they serve, and that means that if you have a board of directors that's a bunch of white guys, that doesn't reflect your customers. It doesn't reflect society. And actually, earlier on this year, I was speaking to John Amici. He's a London-born NBA player. He had a very successful career in NBA, and he is a superb advocate for kind of anti-racism. I mean, not just being, he made a video for the BBC a couple of years back, which went viral, where he talked about the way that it's not enough to say I'm not racist, and I don't, I'm happy for people of any colour or background to have opportunity. You have to actively promote it. And I think the active promotion is so important. And I know that's why John is so passionate about it. It's not enough for us to sit on our hands and say, well, I'm not racist, so therefore there's no problem. Actually, you've got to be much more coherent in terms of promoting it. And I think some teams have done very well. I think Formula One has had some really good initiatives, but the proof of the pudding is whether, when you have that team photograph taken at the end of each year, what's the makeup of the team? Who are the people you're employing at the factory? Who are the schools and universities that you're working with? Who are the people that you are reaching out to and communicating with? And this is, I think, again, why the Hamilton Commission was such a very practical step for Lewis to have taken, and to have people like Martin Whitmarsh, of course, who's now leading the charge for Aston Martin in F1. He was part of the Hamilton Commission, and you look at the diversity of people on the Hamilton Commission, and when I say diversity there, I mean diversity in terms of their backgrounds, their intellectual background of the people who are involved in the Hamilton Commission. Really, really important. And of course then Mercedes-Benz activities with schools in London, in Tower Hamlets, really again a practical step. So I think some teams have been very good at it. I think some have been very poor. I think some have been very silent about the topic, and I think I know why that is. I think some folk in our sport still don't know how to tackle it. They don't really want to tackle it. They don't see that it's an issue, and they don't see that it's an issue because they actually are ignorant of the topic. And as John Amici says, if you're a black person in London walking down the street, you won't go too very, very far before you realize that you're being treated differently. And when I did a corporate event with Lewis just before the pandemic in Singapore, and we, on stage in front of, a group of executives, he was talking about, being bullied at school, and, the racism that was directed at him and his family in his early years, and how that's impacted on his life. So I think the sport has done a great deal. I think what is now really important is to see how that manifests itself in really practical impact. So, hashtags are great. Having flags flying and having logos, and that's all great. You're out there communicating what you aspire to, but what are you actually doing about it practically? I think Jean Todt and the FIA, made some really good steps. On the kind of gender diversity piece, I think W Series has shaken the industry up. Yeah. Not everyone agreed with W Series, but I think you cannot disagree with W Series' view, which is that not enough was being done in a proactive way to help women to become professional racing drivers, and indeed have other roles across the sport. So there needed to be some positive discrimination and a push, and I think that's been really good. But I find it troubling that Michelle Mouton, who has now exited her role in the Women's Commission in the FIA, she didn't like the W Series, and wasn't positively supporting it. And of course the FIA went into their own program, Girls on Track with and working with Ferrari Academy. And this is the kind of thing that frustrates me, is that we need all of the women are in a minority in motorsport. We need all of them to be united in their charge. It's hard enough to fight the battle without there being splits within the group. So, but I think ultimately it's all heading in the right direction. I don't think it's heading in the right direction fast enough. And one final thing that I'll say to you, Farah, on this topic, I find it extraordinary that, considering the amount of money that the 240 companies who sponsor Formula One teams spend on Formula One, I find it extraordinary how few of them support W Series. And I know W Series are finding it frustrating. And I don't really understand that, because if I was a chief marketing officer of a global brand and I had decided that Formula One was worth me positioning my brand against, and putting my brand in the hands of Formula One, I would take a look at the diversity and inclusion in Formula One and say, okay, so what can we do to support this move? And I think it should be automatic that W Series benefits from commercial support from some of those major sponsors, all of those major sponsors. My view would be, if you're not supporting W Series, but you're only supporting Formula One, what does that say about your own biases as an organization? So I would like to see more done in a practical way, and then it's much easier to measure the impact.
Very interesting point you raised there. Yeah, a lot of food for thought. Um, Talking about food for thought, I do highly encourage our audience to check out Mark's book, because you are a highly acclaimed author and you wrote the book, The Business of Winning: Strategic Success from the Formula One Track to the Boardroom. And of course,
Yeah.
it looks at the business lessons to be learned. And you've just brought a new edition out this year in 2021, which I'm really excited to read. So we've talked a lot, obviously, about leadership and how these are, some of the key aspects. And I know that you deliver many keynotes about this topic, and we could obviously talk about it for hours. However, just tell me, two other things that you think a team or an individual can take from Formula One and apply them to business.
Wow. Well, gosh, there's a $60 million question. A couple of key takeaways. I made the point earlier on that for all the technology and high finance, Formula One is a people business, and you have to have that very clear focus as a team to achieve success. But in terms of practical takeaways, I think when I talk, for example, with David Coulthard, and he and I do events together quite often. Something that David is passionate about is that when you've worked in Formula One and then you step outside and go and work in another industry, it's shocking to see the degree to which people compromise. They don't accept, the need to be the best. They're quite happy to compromise and settle for second best. And when David set up Whisper Films with Sunil Patel and Jake Humphrey, and of course Whisper is now highly successful as a I'll call it a television production company, but it's a media production company. Mm-hmm. I know that David was very keen that they ran the company a little bit like a mini Formula One team. Have a debrief each day. What did we do well? What did we do badly? That's something I think all companies could learn from. How many companies sit down at the end of each day, or even at the end of each week, and say, well, how did we do? Have we met all our targets? Has it been a great week? Have we got some things wrong? And if we have got some things wrong, what could we learn from it? How can we improve next week? So that kind of relentless nature of Formula One, where you're constantly measuring, is something that in wider industry seems to be missing. A lot of companies get measured by their quarterly performance. Formula One teams get measured on their weekly performance. It's you win or lose. It's incredibly simple. So I think that sense of focus on how are we doing and what can we do to improve, I think that actually is as relevant for a corner shop as it is for a multinational company. Everyone should be trying to do the best job they possibly can, and any company worth its salt should be saying, how can we do better? So that's kind of one thing. And I think the other thing which I've learned, and it's been a lesson, it's a lesson for me, and I will never be in a leadership role again in a Formula One organization, but if I had my time again, there are things that I would do differently, because I've learned the importance of empowering people and of recognizing the contribution that every person in your team makes. And again, I think that when I meet businesses outside of Formula One, one of the things that often strikes me is that they will maybe have an employee of the month, or they might have an annual award ceremony where they say well done to their top salespeople or whatever. And I make the point that in a Formula One team, we're constantly reviewing how we did, and if we win, or if we have a good day at the office, if we score championship points or get a podium, we have a big celebration, and we share the love. Everyone in the factory is made to feel part of the success of the company. It's not about Lewis winning the race. It's about Brackley and Brixworth winning the Grand Prix, winning the World Championship. It's not about Max. It's about Red Bull Racing and Milton Keynes, which is why Lewis and Max will say as soon as they win a race, thanks to the guys and the girls back at the factory, thanks to the team for their support. And I think too many companies somehow, again, they talk the talk but don't quite walk the walk when it comes to recognizing the contribution that each and every employee makes to their success. And actually, all too often, the chief executives are happy to take the credit when things are going well. And that's a little bit like a Formula One driver who says, well, I won the race. No Formula One driver wins the race on their own. They win the race because of 1,000 people, including their strategy team, which is online real time during the race, devising the best strategy. So I think, again, that's an important learning from the world of Formula One, is again about this recognition and this cohesion across the team, and the recognition that quite literally, whether you drive the car, design the car, drive the van at the factory, work in marketing or finance, you are each playing a key role in the team's success. And I think that's where a Christian Horner and a Toto Wolff, again, are very similar. They understand that the sum of the parts is so important to achieve success.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're only as good as your weakest link in the end, right? Now we could talk about this also for a while, but obviously it's the F1 season is finally kicking off this weekend, and I can't let you go without pricking your brains on sort of your thoughts on what happened last year. Were you happy with the outcome in the way that it happened? And what are your sort of predictions for this upcoming season?
I can imagine that some fans, particularly of Max, were very happy with the outcome, and to the exclusion of all else in 2021. But I would describe myself as a Max fan, and I'm also a Lewis fan. I'm a Formula One fan. I love watching Mercedes and Red Bull do the business. That's just brilliant to see what they do. I would feel I'm a genuine fan of the sport, and therefore, from my point of view, it was highly dissatisfying because it led to rancor and disillusionment and argument and toxicity in the media and social media, mainstream media, and I was disheartened by that experience. And I remember posting on Twitter a very well-intentioned tweet about the fact that Lewis was being knighted at Windsor Castle, and I said something to the effect that hopefully being knighted will give Lewis cause to reflect on the huge achievements that he has made in his life and his work. A few days after the disappointment of Saudi Arabia, and that was taken as me saying that being knighted somehow made up for losing the World Championship, which of course is not what the tweet said, and it certainly wasn't what it intended. But I had this backlash, and I had people saying to me, well, you're just this white guy who didn't want Lewis Hamilton to win a world championship. So again, the toxicity that came out of Saudi Arabia Grand Prix result was disheartening. I profoundly disagree with social media and mainstream media campaigning against Michael Massey, and people who really ought to know better, and indeed people who often champion mental health and the support and welfare for people in their lives, those very same people campaigning against Michael Massey. And all I can say is I hope they never get to experience a 10th or 100th of what Michael Massey has had to put up with because of a decision that he made, which rightly or wrongly led to what happened in Saudi Arabia. And it just felt like the whole thing was handled very badly, from not just the initial decision making, but the way it was explained, the aftermath of the race. I think there was an opportunity in the aftermath of the race to possibly reflect on whether that had been the right decision to make for the final lap. I think the teams handled it quite badly in some ways. There was some prevarication from teams around the messaging that they were putting out, but ultimately, the sport kind of began to brush it under the carpet and move on, and that's left a slightly sour taste. So I think 2021 was a fantastic World Championship, and we'll look back on it with a lot of pleasure for individual races. But no one will look back, I think, in the fullness of time. I don't think anyone will look back on the outcome of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix with any degree of pleasure. And I think even within Red Bull and amongst Max Verstappen fans, there will always be a sense that something slightly strange happened that day, and therefore that somehow disturbs the purity of Max's World Championship. And that's a shame, because he deserves to be a world champion in Formula One. He is a fantastic racing driver and had a superb season. But I think the messiness caused by what happened in that race will take a long time to dissipate in terms of the atmosphere that it created. And the fact remains, Farah, that it will never be forgotten. And people will be talking about the controversial end of the 2021 championship in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years time. It'll be like talking about Senna and Prost in colliding in Suzuka, and it'll be all the other sort of things that have happened in Formula One from a controversial perspective over the years. And I think that's a shame, because when I think about Ayrton Senna, I want to think about the great moments. When I think about Michael Schumacher, I want to think about the great moments. When I think about Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton, I want to think about the great moments. I don't want to think about controversies, because yes, it's part and parcel of the sport, but when it's self-inflicted in the way that happened in that final race, it's just a shame. So it definitely tinged, our enjoyment of what had been a meteoric season. In terms of looking forward to this year on a more positive note, I mean, we did have such a terrific year, didn't we, in 2021? So this year, 22, we got new regulations, new cars, a slightly more level playing field in theory. I personally have a belief in the fact that the great innovators in this sport, people like Adrian Newey, James Allison and his team at Mercedes, they will not be producing mirror image cars of the kind that the regulations were suggesting last year. They will be looking for the loopholes and the opportunities to exploit those regulations for competitive advantage. So I fully expect us to see some surprises this year with teams producing designs and developments which the regulators will not have seen coming. I think that the big established teams, Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, will once again be the teams to beat. I think hopefully Ferrari's resurgence will continue. I think McLaren should benefit from the new rules in Formula One. I think Alpine, if they capitalise on the success of last year, should also be a bigger threat this year. And I think Williams will continue to make progress this year. But we're not going to turn up in a week's time and see Haas win the opening race or Alfa Romeo dominate the World Championship. It's we're not going to see the world turned upside down. What we are going to see is we're going to see a greater opportunity for more teams to perhaps produce a surprise. But I suspect we'll still be seeing Christian Horner, Mattia Binotto and Toto Wolff giving the lion's share of team principal interviews once again this season.
How do you think the dynamic between George and Lewis will play out?
Oh, it's going to be fascinating. So I have to admit, share my hand here. I'm a big fan of Valtteri Bottas. I think again because he's a great driver, and he won 10 Grand Prix, and he had the unenviable job of being teammate to the greatest driver of the modern era in Formula One, and he gets slagged off every time he has a bad race. I'd love to see some of his critics been given half a chance to do what he did, and I'm delighted to see him at Alfa Romeo and leading the team. And this is my segue into saying that I couldn't have thought of a better person to replace him than George Russell. I think George is a very, I mean, I don't know George, so he comes across as a very fine person, highly thought of at Williams. Jos Capito was at great lengths to explain to me what a great person and driver they felt that George was, and therefore a loss to Williams. We know how quick he is because not only have we seen his performances at Williams, but of course we saw him deputise for Lewis in that memorable outing at the end of 2020. So, you know, we know George is going to be right there. The big question, and the one that I know will be occupying the minds of George and Lewis and James Allison and Toto Wolff and all of their colleagues at Mercedes, is can they manage two such highly competitive drivers this time in a better way than they achieved with Nico Rosberg and Lewis? Because we know from all of their interviews, and indeed I was on a podcast with James Allison at the end of 2020, and James admitted, you know, he said it was toxic, you know, the atmosphere at times, very destructive. The atmosphere at times with Lewis and Nico, the team went down the wrong path in terms of how that was managed, which is one of the reasons why the Valtteri-Lewis relationship was so great, because there was effectively a number one and number two in the team, even though they didn't have those titles. The reality is everyone could see that there was a pecking order, and on a number of occasions Valtteri was asked to support Lewis, and so he did, which was the right thing to do. So the big question is whether that balance can somehow be achieved. Can George accept the fact that perhaps for this year and maybe even next year that he has to not play second fiddle, but be prepared to support Lewis? Really important that they don't get into a fight with each other, which then hands opportunities to their rivals. Really important they don't start colliding, which of course we saw with Lewis and Nico infamously as well. So there's lots of things that we don't want to see, but what we do want to see is George and Lewis be the best version of themselves, pushing each other like hell, hopefully separated by a few hundredths of a second, having some really close racing between themselves, and most importantly beating the competition. So it's going to be great. And of course for British fans, just to be a little bit jingoistic for a moment, you know, for British fans, I mean, what a luxury. You know, they've got the greatest team in Formula One in modern times with two British drivers, George and Lewis, and, you know, two very fine guys as well with, you know, great reputations as people as well as drivers. So it feels like it ought to be a golden era, and let's hope it is, because I would love to see Formula One come out of the pandemic with a really bright future with drivers like Lewis and George providing great entertainment and excitement.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely going to have the popcorn out for this one. We've just got two final short sections left. I know we're almost out of time, so we'll make it quick. We've got a couple of questions that come in from our audience. The first one is from Leon. This is a great question. Knowing that you're a public speaker, he's asking, what are your tips for gripping an audience and really inspiring them as a speaker?
My tips for gripping an audience. Humour is incredibly important. I think humour is a great leveler, because if you can get people to laugh, you've won them over, and that's a great way of engaging. And I've got a number of ways that I try and do that. It's much more difficult with virtual events than, of course, live events, because with live events you can walk out on stage, you can connect with an audience, and it's a very different approach than virtual, where you aren't getting any feedback. It's also very difficult to deliver humour, you know, on a virtual platform, because there's nothing worse than someone laughing at their own jokes. So you can't laugh at yourself, and obviously you can't hear the audience laughing. So, but humour generally for me, I think it is one important point. The other thing is know your stuff and dive in with good facts and figures and insights, and, you know, don't beat around the bush. I start my presentations by giving usually a little bit of context around Formula One, and one of the things I like to do at the beginning is to burst some perceptions about Formula One. And most audiences that I speak to are not Formula One fans. They are business executives, and maybe 10% of them or 15% of them might be following the sport in some way, but the vast majority just know Formula One as some kind of car racing. They heard of a guy called Schumacher, they've heard of a guy called Hamilton, and that's probably about it. So when you come on stage and you say, well, a Formula One team is a technology company, immediately people are thinking, really? Are they a technology company? And then, of course, when you say that the racing team is only 10% of the employees in the team, that actually 100 people go to the race but 900 or 1,000 might be back in the factory, then people start thinking, well, so what do all of those other people do? So then you introduce people to the fact that the sport is quite unique in that you have to design and manufacture this great big piece of complex technology to compete in Formula One. And actually you're working with aerospace technology, automotive technology, and information technology, because it's a great big connected device. So part of my approach is to educate, surprise, inform, throw some cool things at them to make them reflect on how interesting Formula One is. And I think the best feedback that I get is not the feedback that says, oh, we loved your speech, we really enjoyed that. The best feedback is when you get a message from someone on LinkedIn saying, I really hated Formula One and now I think it's amazing because I didn't realize all that stuff. I thought it was just a bunch of cars going around in a circle, and I'd never thought about the fact that drivers used to get killed doing this, and that safety has improved so much. And I never thought about the fact that it's a data-driven sport, or I didn't know that Lewis Hamilton's race strategy has been decided by a team of people back at headquarters in Brackley who are looking at all of the real-time data and information. So that's my approach. It's all about using the opportunity to give insight, and if you can throw in a little bit of humor, people will enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very well answered. The next question is from Hannah in Copenhagen. She says, having led so many world-class teams, is there one particular question you always ask a job applicant?
How? I think the most important thing is to ask a job applicant what it is that makes them leap out of bed and come to work in the morning. What's the one thing that fires them up and makes them want to work in the team and to contribute? Why do you want to be a contributor to our success? What is it that fires you up? I think that's far more important than academic qualifications or experience. I think that there are 19-year-olds who can contribute as much to a Formula One team as a 47-year-old with a PhD in aeronautical engineering. It's what do you bring as a person? What do you bring? That's the thing that comes out time and again. Obviously, the academic qualifications they're an indication, and obviously that gives you a certain expertise. But again, when I rather than just coming from me, I can tell you that when Mercedes-Benz or Red Bull are employing someone, they want to understand what makes that person tick and how will they fit into the team as a human being. How will they contribute? Because if the human aspect is wrong, if the motivations are wrong, if the ambition is not aligned with the team, it's going to be hopeless. And I think that's again, it comes back to the people factor.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It always comes down to your why. So final section, quick fire round, not more than 30 to 60 seconds on each. Number one, if you're a car, what would it be?
An Alpine.
Okay. What was the last song that you played? In your drive, or just the last song that you played, I guess.
Oh gosh, in terms of songs, I have to admit that I'm as likely to be playing Dua Lipa as I am to be playing Sting, and all points in between. And I love music. I was a musician as a child. I played in an orchestra for 14 years, so I love music. And I'm as likely to put on some classical as contemporary music.
Interesting. How do you like to start your day?
I love to. I mean, I'm a news hound. I'm a news fiend. I love to start my day on social media, get a flavour of what's happening in the world. Partly also because I think on social media I'm quite likely to get a good belly laugh early on in the day from something I see on social media. And for all that I've talked in the podcast about the toxicity that we see in social media, I do use it.
Interesting. We always ask our guests this question as a final question on Mission Makers, and that is, what are you most grateful for this month?
What am I most grateful for this month? I think, unquestionably, it's my family, and that's a slightly boring answer, but again, I think with the passage of time, you get to reflect on personal and professional achievements and all the rest of it. But I'm as we're running up to the start of the Formula One season, I'm in Australia. I'm going to be staying here through to the Melbourne Grand Prix, which hopefully will take place this year. And my son and daughter work here in Australia. My son works in the space industry. My daughter works in animation in Sydney. And, we're all together. And that's the thing that I'm most, grateful for this month, and probably this year, and probably in my life.
No, that's a beautiful way to end. And I couldn't agree more. And especially when you dedicate so much of your life to work and travel and not getting all of those beautiful moments to be with your family, it's everything, and it's the fuel that keeps you going, really. So thank you so much, Mark, for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, we really hopefully will catch up with you soon.
Yeah, it's been a privilege. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the listeners who have been with us over the last hour or so, and thanks for making me one of your mission makers. I don't know, victims is the right word, or candidates, but anyway, it's been lovely. Thank you so much indeed.
Take care.
Thank you.
If you want to grab a copy of today's show notes, then head over to missionmakers.com/Mark Gallagher, where you'll also find notes from all of our previous episodes. We've got one final guest left for season 3, and it's safe to say he's an absolute legend in dance music. Known to many around the world for his dreamy, forward-thinking sounds. It's the one and only Lee Burridge. So be sure to share this show with your friends and subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. You can reach out to me at Mission Makers or at dj.n1nja on Instagram. And if you're interested in supporting the show and getting some cool rewards like virtual DJ lessons and exclusive merchandise, don't forget to visit patreon.com/Mission Makers. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep it laser focused.